Hello again. In this video, I want to go over the Robert McDougall reading for week 2. And what I want to do is use it to explain two things. Firstly, how the McDougall piece helps us to understand the importance of the Turkle reading in terms of where it fits into the broader landscape of media research and media theory. And then the second thing I want to do is I want to talk about how the ideas that McDougall explores have a particular influence on the kinds of research questions that we ask in media studies. And the most important thing for you to get out of this is the distinction that McDougall makes between representational and non-representational theories of the mind. And the way in which that distinction and the shift towards non-representational theories of the mind has a distinct influence on how we approach media research questions. So I suppose the broad overview is that McDougall helps us understand how Turkle's work is part of a tradition that errs towards what he calls a non-representational theory of the mind, and how this non-representational approach has a changes how we view the sorts of questions that we would ask of the media. And it's kind of important because what we're going to discover is that most of the questions that we ask in everyday life tend to belong to a body of theory that he calls representational theories of the mind. And there are some distinct limitations associated with that approach. So let's go over, firstly, representational theories of the mind. So this dude here, Rene Descartes, famous for the quote, I think, therefore I am. And this idea this idea is generally seen as being the basis for a particularly popular and powerful way of thinking about the nature of the individual and the relationship between the individual and society that arguably still drives a lot of popular and political thought. And the idea here is that society is built on the mental labor of very, very smart people. That's basically it. You may have heard of a great person theory of history, the idea that history is driven by incredibly powerful, incredibly creative, or indeed incredibly evil people, and that the power of their will changes everything. So this, I guess, is really a popular way of thinking about your relationship with the world. You know, this idea of all this self-help stuff about if you can imagine it, you can be it. You can be anything you want to be. Well, you can't. Not really. The idea that you can be anything you want to be, regardless of who you're surrounded by and what resources you have access to, is really a nonsense for all but a very, very such a tiny number of people that just not even really worth talking about. But nevertheless, this idea that we have an inner being, and it's our inner free will and inner mental capacity that determines global history, is a very powerful one, and it's an idea that we use in everyday life. When we say things like "it's what's inside that counts" and "stay true to yourself," as if the self exists in isolation from the external world. This is a very powerful idea. So the representational theory of the mind kind of posits the mind as an inner being. So the mind is co-determinist with the brain, and society works when the things that are going on in here are projected outwards. Now, how does that relate to media? Well, we might look at, and everybody does this, and it is an important question. It's not an irrelevant question, but you might see a particular movie and you want to know what the end, like for example, me, right? I love horror movies, absolutely love horror movies. And I love movies with a twist in them. So, um, a big fan of, like, for example, movies like Summerland, right? And Hereditary, where you're trying to figure out what is the meaning of this movie, and you kind of want to go, and the neat thing about these movies is you can go online and you can kind of ask the director about, or search up what the director is thinking when he's making these movies. And quite often it's kind of frustrating, because if you do that, the director will say, I don't know. It's up to you to decide what that meant. But that kind of activity is very much driven by the desire to, the tendency to think that the meaning of a movie is related to the intention of the person who made it. And we all think a bit about that way, but for reasons that I'm going to explain in just a second, that's actually quite a naive, unsophisticated way of thinking about how media works. So this moves us forward to what McDougall was talking about, which is about the importance of non-representational theories of the mind. And the thing that McDougall points to very, very importantly is that Sherry Turkle's work that posits that the mind exists. So we've got two different things. We've got the brain, which is definitely inside our heads. But then you've got the mind, and the mind somehow is something. The mind and thinking, or our experience of thinking, lives somewhere between the brain and the external social world, and it's the interaction. So the mind is betwixt the individual and culture. And this is a very popular idea that's developed through work on media technologies. In the work of, I've got some key texts here. So we've got Walter Ong's Orality and Literacy, Harold Innis's The Bias of Communication, Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. One of the core ideas of all of this being that new technologies, new ways of storing and retrieving and narrating information really had profound impacts on the way that we exist and the way that we think as individuals. And Turkle's work clearly belongs within this systems theory on the relationship between communication and identity. That is one of the things that media theory does and communications research does, and research on communication technologies and media industries and these sorts of things, is that they all in some way rely on a non-representational theory of communication. And what that more non-representational theory of the mind. And what this posits is that communication as a process that connects different intentions and different groups and different people is a primary focus in creating social reality. So the representational theory of the mind argues that reality really is kind of inside our heads. We have an idea and we make it real in the material world. Whereas non-representational theories very much stress the interactional nature of meaning. So there's no, firstly, you can only have an idea insofar as society educates you and positions you with an ability to have that idea, and also insofar as it creates opportunities, external cultural and social opportunities, for you to put that idea into practice. So that's really what non-representational theories of the mind are about. They're about appreciating how reality is produced by interactions between the self and external society via the modes of communication. And that's why when you change how we communicate, you change social reality. So how do you then move that on to thinking about how that affects the sorts of questions we would ask or the sorts of approaches we would take to media research? And I think there are a few things. Firstly, when we talk about meaning, I mean, the meaning of media is tremendously important. But I suppose one of the things we want to get away from is the idea that the meaning of media can be reduced down to the intention of the people who made that particular text. There's a couple of problems with that. Um, Firstly, um, the media products are produced through systems, through industries, where a variety of different intentions and factors come into play. So, obviously, it matters who writes a particular drama or a particular advert or whatever it is, or a particular song. That's obviously important, but it's not the only thing that determines the ultimate meaning and impact of a particular media event in the social realm. And there's all kinds of examples of how um, songwriters, for example, have been horrified by the way their lyrics have been interpreted. It was a million miles from the things that they were intending. Um, But again, what we're talking about is if you look at a systems theory of media, meaning is something that emerges over time through the interaction of different elements of a system of production, consumption, distribution. All of these things can affect how a particular media experience um, attains a social meaning. So, meaning isn't something that's immanent in a particular movie and simply as a matter of projecting that meaning outwards. A meaning quite often is something that evolves over a long period of time. And in that sense, again, when we're talking about meaning in the media, we're not necessarily thinking about what a particular advertiser intends or what a particular director intends or what a writer intends. We're really more thinking about how that particular media event, media thing attains a social significance and a social meaning over a long period of time through a number of different social dynamics. Now, elsewhere on this unit, as you know, I've kind of worked up an example of the sort of project you might do um, in reference to the recent story about Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex leaving the royal family. And we can use this to explain the ideas I'm trying to get at here, because in many respects, we can say that this particular story isn't really about Meghan or Harry, but it's rather about how the system of celebrity, so the celebrity industry, has had an impact on the institution of the royal family. So, of course, Harry and Meghan are real people who have real feelings about these things. But from the point of view of a media scholar, those inner states don't really matter. All that matters is what becomes publicly available. And what becomes publicly available, sure, of course, they've made the decision to do what they've done. They've made the decision to deploy certain media strategies in doing that. But none of that would happen at all without the existence of a broader celebrity industry. And that again is what we get to when we begin thinking about media communication in terms of interactive systems, where we're focusing more on collective, collaborative, evolutionary meanings as they emerge through a number of actors over time. So that just elaborates a little bit more on McDougall, and the point is that McDougall helps us locate Turkle's work in a broader trend that's evolved over 100 years, really, in media theory. And it also helps explain how these sorts of ideas apply to the kind of research you might do. And what I've also done is I've applied that particular reading to the case study, to the example project that I've done for you. So I hope all of that makes sense. And if it doesn't, hit me up on the Moodle forum, or I'll see you in class. Okay, bye.